1793 was the year the sun set on the old world and rose upon a landscape painted in the color of blood. But amidst the chaotic roar of the French Revolution and the mechanical rhythm of the guillotine, a far more sinister and silent tragedy was unfolding behind the thick limestone walls of a medieval tower. While the history books often reduce the fall of the French monarchy to dates, battles, and the final sharp drop of the blade, the true horror lies in the 76 days of calculated psychological torture designed to dismantle a woman who had once been the most powerful queen in Europe. This is not merely a story about execution, but rather a forensic examination of how the Committee of Public Safety, the architects of the Reign of Terror, discovered that the blade was too quick a punishment for Marie Antoinette and decided instead to break her humanity piece by piece, starting with the only thing she had left to live for. To understand the magnitude of this cruelty, one must look past the caricature of the cake-eating villainess and see the prisoner known only as 280, a mother trapped in a nightmare where her own love was weaponized against her in a display of malice that still chills the archives of history to this very day. It began on the night of July 3, 1793, within the suffocating confines of the Temple Prison, a fortress built by the Knights Templar that had been converted into a gilded cage for the fallen royal family. The air was thick with the humid heat of a Paris summer and the stagnant dread of captivity, when the silence was shattered not by the mob outside, but by the heavy, ominous thud of boots echoing up the spiral stone staircase, growing louder and more purposeful with every step. Inside the room, Marie Antoinette lay awake, her body serving as a protective barrier around her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, the boy whom royalists now considered Louis XVII, for she had not let him leave her sight for a single moment since his father, Louis XVI, was dragged to the scaffold 6 months prior. When the door exploded open, revealing 6 municipal officers armed with an order from the Committee of Public Safety, the atmosphere in the room shifted from anxiety to primal terror, because they had not come to inspect the quarters or issue threats. They had come to take the boy. What ensued was not a polite exchange of diplomatic protocols, but a raw, agonizing hour of physical and emotional warfare that saw the former Queen of France transform into a desperate lioness, throwing her failing body between the men and her weeping child. For 60 agonizing minutes she fought them, screaming until her vocal cords shredded, clinging to the bedpost and her son's clothes, pleading for them to kill her right there rather than separate her from the boy who was her last tether to sanity. The guards, frustrated by her hysterical resistance, finally played their trump card, threatening to kill her teenage daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who were watching in horror from the corner of the room. Defeated by the threat to her other loved ones, Marie Antoinette's resistance collapsed into a heap of sobbing grief, and she was forced to dress her son, hugging him with a frantic intensity, whispering final words of love that he would likely never understand, before watching him be dragged away into the stairwell, his cries fading into the darkness of the tower, leaving her in a silence so profound it felt like death. The cruelty of this separation was not accidental, but deeply strategic, for the revolutionaries knew that Marie Antoinette, the Austrian woman they had spent decades vilifying, was impervious to their usual methods of intimidation. They had stripped her of her crown, her palaces, her jewels, and her husband, yet she remained upright, possessing a Habsburg dignity that infuriated her captors. So they decided to strike at the maternal bond, the one vulnerability she could not shield. To fully grasp why she was the target of such specific venom, one must rewind to who she was before the tragedy. A young archduchess born Maria Antonia in Vienna, shipped off to France at the tender age of 14 to cement a geopolitical alliance between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. From the moment she crossed the border, she was stripped of her Austrian clothing, her German hairdos were pulled out, and her CA-once lunch set was taken. From that moment, she was not Maria Antonia, the Austrian princess. She was Marie Antoinette, daughter of France.
Friends and even her dog, forced to become the property of the French state and married to a shy, awkward dauphin who ignored her for 7 years. The court at Versailles was a snake pit of gossip, where she was mocked for her accent and blamed for her inability to produce an heir. leading her to retreat into a world of fashion, gambling, and parties at the Petit Trianon, not out of malice, but out of loneliness and boredom. The press branded her Madame Deficit, blaming her for the nation's bankruptcy while ignoring the costly wars and centuries of systemic inequality that were the true culprits. And by the time the Bastille fell, she had become the universal scapegoat for every hunger pang in Paris. But the woman sitting in the Temple prison in 1793 was no longer the frivolous girl of Versailles. She was a prematurely aged widow, suffering from tuberculosis and possible uterine cancer, hemorrhaging blood and stripping bedsheets to maintain her hygiene, yet still possessing a steely resolve that the Republic was determined to shatter. After dragging her son away, the revolutionaries handed Louis Charles over to a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler and staunch Jacobin, who was given specific instructions not to kill the boy, but to destroy his mind and soul. In the room directly beneath Marie Antoinette's cell, a horrific re-education program began, where the young prince was forced to drink alcohol until he passed out, taught to sing lewd revolutionary songs, and coerced into cursing his mother's name in a voice loud enough to drift through the floorboards. Day after day, Marie Antoinette sat in her room, listening to the drunken sounds of her son being corrupted, hearing his voice warp and change as he was turned into a puppet of the state, a psychological torture far worse than any physical blow they could have landed on her. Then, in the dead of night on August 1, 1793, the guards returned, waking her with a sudden order to dress because she was being transferred to
The Conciergerie, the grim holding facility on the Ile de la Cité, known as the antechamber to the guillotine. She was not allowed to say goodbye to her daughter or sister-in-law, merely hurried down the stairs and thrown into a carriage, leaving behind the last remnants of her family to enter a solitary hell where she would officially become prisoner 280. The cell at the Conciergerie was a damp, subterranean dungeon with water trickling down the green, mold-covered walls, located so close to the River Seine that the air was perpetually heavy with moisture and the smell of rot. Her furniture consisted of a folding cot, a straw mattress, a cane chair, and a bucket. But the true punishment was the absolute erasure of her privacy. 2 gendarmes were stationed inside her tiny cell 24 hours a day, separated from her only by a flimsy, waist-high screen, ordered to watch her every move, even as she slept, dressed, or relieved herself. This constant, unblinking surveillance was designed to degrade her, to strip away the mystique of royalty and reduce her to a biological entity with no secrets and no dignity. Under these horrific conditions, her health collapsed completely. Her vision blurred, her body racked with convulsions, and her hair, once a strawberry blonde halo, turned stark white from the relentless stress, a physical manifestation of her trauma, now known medically as Marie Antoinette syndrome. Yet even as she bled and withered in that dark hole, she fashioned a small locket to hold a lock of her children's hair and refused to give the guards the satisfaction of seeing her cry, maintaining a regal silence that unnerved the men sent to watch her die. The endgame arrived on October 14, 1793, when she was hauled before the Revolutionary Tribunal for a show trial that was never intended to be a quest for justice, but rather a public execution of her character before the physical execution of her body. The prosecutor, the ruthless Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, unleashed a torrent of accusations that ranged from sending French gold to Austria to orchestrating orgies at Versailles, painting her as a monster who had single-handedly destroyed the nation. Marie Antoinette, dressed in a tattered black mourning dress and looking decades older than her 37 years, answered the charges with a calm, articulate logic that dismantled the prosecution's lies and exposed the lack of evidence. Panic set in among the revolutionaries as they realized the Austrian wolf was winning the crowd with her dignity, so they decided to deploy the weapon they had been forging in the darkness of the Temple prison. Jacques Hébert, a radical journalist, took the stand and presented the testimony coerced from her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, accusing his own mother of committing incestuous acts with him.
A silence of absolute shock descended upon the courtroom, for even in the blood-soaked insanity of the terror, this accusation was so vile, so obviously fabricated by torturing a child, that it breached the boundaries of human decency. Marie Antoinette sat frozen for a moment, the horror of what they had done to her son washing over her, before she rose to her feet and delivered one of the most powerful rebuttals in history, her voice cracking with emotion as she declared, "I appeal to the conscience and feelings of every mother present to say if there be one who would not shudder at such horrors." The courtroom erupted, and for a fleeting moment the market women and revolutionaries saw not a queen, but a mother whose child had been destroyed by the state. Yet the verdict was a foregone conclusion written long before the trial began. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, she was condemned to death for high treason and depletion of the national treasury, and she was taken back to her cell to prepare for the end. In those final hours, by the flickering light of a tallow candle, she wrote a letter to Madame Elizabeth, a document that stands as a testament to her extraordinary resilience and grace. She did not plead for her innocence. She knew such words were meaningless. Instead, she owned her actions as queen, expressing regret over any missteps, and urged her sister-in-law to remember her love and to ensure that her children never again faced the jealousy of the people.
Not rail against the injustice or curse the French people. Instead, she wrote of her love for her children, urging them not to seek revenge for her death, and expressed a clear conscience, forgiving her enemies with a spiritual fortitude that defied the circumstances. Tragically, she handed this letter to the Garde Boult, believing it would reach her family, but it was immediately seized by Robespierre's agents and buried in the archives, never to be seen by the intended recipients, meaning her final words of love echoed into a void. As the morning sun rose over Paris, the executioner Henri Sanson arrived to perform the final ritual of humiliation, roughly shearing off her white hair with scissors to ensure the blade would meet no resistance, and binding her hands behind her back with a coarse rope, pulling it so tight that she gasped in pain. When she complained that her husband had not been bound, the guards ignored her, denying her even the small courtesies granted to the king. Unlike Louis XVI, who was transported to the scaffold in a closed carriage that shielded him from the mob, Marie Antoinette was forced to climb into an open tumbril, a dirty wooden cart used for hauling dung in criminals, exposing her to the wrath of the city. For over an hour, she sat on a hard wooden plank, her back rigid, her eyes fixed on the horizon, enduring a gauntlet of abuse as thousands of Parisians lined the streets to jeer, spit, and scream insults at the woman they blamed for all their suffering. The artist Jacques-Louis David, watching from a window, sketched her as she passed, capturing the haunting image of a woman stripped of everything but her pride, her lip curled in defiance, her face a mask of impenetrable stoicism. When the cart finally rumbled to a halt at the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, she climbed the steps to the guillotine without assistance, her legs weak but her will unbroken, forcing herself to walk toward the machine that had claimed her husband. In her final moments on earth, confused and blinded by the rush of adrenaline, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and rather than ignoring him, she turned and whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." These were the last words of Marie Antoinette, a polite apology to her killer that encapsulated the tragedy of a woman who remained a lady even in the face of barbarism. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell, severing the head of the last queen of France, which was then lifted by the hair and displayed to the roaring crowd, marking the end of the Ancien regime. The revolutionaries believed that by killing her, they would erase her power and validate their new republic. But in their zeal to destroy her, they achieved the exact opposite. They wanted to expose a monster, but instead, through their relentless psychological torture, the separation from her son, and the indignity of her imprisonment, they revealed a human being of profound courage. The story of Prisoner 280 is not just a chapter in the French Revolution. It is a timeless warning about what happens when political ideology extinguishes empathy, and a testament to the fact that while you can imprison the body and break the heart, the human spirit, in its final moments, can still choose grace over hate.
If this deep dive into the psychological destruction of Marie Antoinette has changed the way you view the history of the French Revolution, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more dark history documentaries and leave a comment below telling us if you think she was a villain, a victim, or something far more complex.